Hey guys, if you're an organization looking to achieve Essential 8 compliance and leverage Microsoft 365, stay tuned because in this video, I'm going to show you the exact mapping between Microsoft 365 security controls and the Essential 8 that you can implement to achieve this level of compliance. I'm also going to be showing you a tool that you can leverage that automates the evidence collection and checks for these policies within a Microsoft tenant.
So diving in here, guys, my name is Nick. I'm a Microsoft MVP and also CEO and founder of CloudCapsule, which is an automated security assessment tool for Microsoft 365. I'll be showcasing that lightly today just because we've made an automated mapping to the Essential 8. But at a very high level here to get things kicked off, the Essential 8 is a framework developed by the Australian Cybersecurity Center. And at a very high level, it's a prioritized set of 8 mitigation strategies you can leverage that ultimately reduces your attack surface and makes it harder for adversaries to compromise your systems. When we talk about why that matters, why should you pay attention to this? A lot of it's been brought down to us from the government layer, or it may be required in some instances here to try to go out and achieve this. But when you think about this at a very macro layer, we want to have a framework that gives us a North Star for a sense of priority, but also allows us to do a gap analysis of where we are today so we can set goals and have a continuous improvement plan for cybersecurity over time. And the Essential 8 does this and bucketizes this framework into 3 maturity levels. And the first maturity level is really related to basic cybersecurity hygiene. And then maturity level 3 goes up to high resilience, hard to compromise, but often, increases in complexity, increases in end user impact, as well as the impact overall to the organization. So it does allow you to have some sense of progression and goal setting that you can have. But at the very high level too, this does work hand in hand, as you'll see today, with Microsoft 365 tools, your existing licensing, and policies that you can push out. But it also allows you to, again, do that gap analysis of where you are today. So as we go through this particular framework here, I'm going to be walking through each of the mitigation strategies, each of the 8 that is included here. But I will also be including a link in the description of this video that'll take you to a self-assessment that you can leverage, which gives you all the policies here that map to the Essential 8 controls in a way to go ahead and manually check this within a Microsoft tenant. These controls, by the way, were not developed by me. They were developed by Microsoft, and I'll link that documentation as well here too. I've just updated it here to be very modern with the existing solutions that exist in the Microsoft security stack today. We'll also be showcasing the CloudCapsule automated assessment as part of this as well too. And this allows you to automate both the evidence collection for these controls as well as the pass-fail values on over 70% of the technical controls that are part of this framework. So I'll link that below as well too, so you can check that out. You can run a free assessment on your tenant and see where you stand today. But as we dive in here, these slides are very much formatted the same for each of the mitigation strategies. They're going to have up at the top here some of the considerations for the end user resistance. How impactful is that to them? How much friction are you introducing, right, to the organization? The upfront cost, this could be monetary in certain ways, but costs can be delineated into obviously the monetary value, but also the cost as far as the time spent and labor going into each one of these controls, as well as just the cost of the change to the organization. And then the ongoing maintenance could be very much the labor intensive part of how much do you have to keep this up to date. Patching applications is a great example where ongoing maintenance is high, upfront cost is high, but user resistance is low because this is something where we need to be able to do this programmatically in many ways to avoid friction, but we also want to limit the capabilities that a user would have on their device, where normally they would need admin privileges to update applications, right, as an example. With each one of these controls, we're going to go through the Microsoft solutions. We're going to go through some of the challenges, some of the prerequisites, and then I've basically given you a simplistic matrix that outlines both the licensing fulfillment on a feature level for business users versus enterprise users. And potentially there might be some add-ons mixed in with that as well too. So within patching applications here, one of the primary combinations you're going to be leveraging, which is actually included in Business Premium, is Defender for Business or Defender for Endpoint that allows you to do active vulnerability scanning for applications on your workstations. And then you're going to be leveraging Intune to actively package, deploy, and update applications on those workstations. Now, there's some asterisks to that because Intune has a long way to go, in my opinion, for being a full package manager that you could leverage to essentially update and deploy, where a lot of people today are using third-party tools or RMM to do this. But a lot of the complexity also brews from the fact that there's hundreds of applications potentially in a client environment, and it's really hard from a central deployment perspective to keep up with the latest version programmatically versus having users do that, which is obviously going to lead to a lot of vulnerabilities on those devices. Within the Security Admin Center in Microsoft, you can go under the vulnerability section here to view a vulnerability dashboard, which gives you a holistic exposure score based off of both vulnerabilities on software as well as exposure for security recommendations that they have within here as well too. But fundamentally, you do get a software inventory for your applications here. You do get indications for public exploits, weaknesses, things like that. And you do have an indication, if you click into these, on the actual installed devices, so the scope, and you can understand if you open up the software inventory, the actual version distribution, and the event timeline. So understanding when these vulnerabilities were aware or became aware to the organization based off of the CVE integration that Microsoft has. In the Intune portal, you can package and deploy applications here, and you have concepts to deploy applications across various different platform types, not just Windows. And this does allow you in Windows now to have what's known as supersedence for application updates. But there's a couple different ways, obviously, to do this that might be more efficient than the other. But this allows you a way to centrally deploy applications to devices that are approved versus having capabilities where users can either install their own applications because they have local admin rights or because there's never really been a time where an approved software inventory was defined. In CloudCapsule, you can come in and run a security scan on a tenant, and as part of that, you'll have this mapping to the Essential 8. And as we dive into the patching applications section here, when we talk about the maturity levels, the biggest delineation with this particular mitigation is that you're going to have considerations as you step up for how quickly that you are responding to these types of incidents based off of the criticality of that incident, like a public exploit versus just there's a known vulnerability on there as well. And then how quickly are you actually remediating it based off of the first activity date? So this is where we actually showcase to you, all the details. We show the actual evidence as far as the affected software goes. And if you click into this, you can see the machines in scope, the machines that are applicable, and then the active CVEs and the first detected date. So this is actually failing because we have these applications within here that are beyond the scope of the time frame and based off the criticality as well. So this is actually giving you all of that information in one spot. When we talk about the licensing here, this is not going to be available on licensing like Business Standard. Business Premium is a great combination for the two. And then you have considerations, obviously this being within E5, and you have considerations also for some more advanced app deployments with the Intune Suite add-on. When we talk about getting started and tips for getting started with each one of these, first thing here is you want to get your devices activated for Defender. They just need to be enrolled into Intune. You can do this programmatically without pushing out any agents or anything like that. You want to take that inventory and obviously start to remediate or remove any applications that have public exploits. Those are going to be your most significant risk exposure to the tenant. You want to focus on higher risk apps to begin with, like your Office applications, any third-party security tools that are in place, like AV tools, web browsers like Chrome that have a high amount of activity, and start with those as a secondary list. You want to remove any unapproved software, so you just reduce the amount of overhead that it takes. And then you want to define an SOP for app vulnerabilities. And so this is a way for you to understand, what are we doing when we discover and we're alerted on a new app vulnerability? What is our process for doing that? I have some recommendations that I've written previous blog posts on that I'll link below here as well too. But the big thing to take away with patching applications and third-party patching is that this is if you're an MSP out there, a shared responsibility matrix. This should be something where you're not necessarily in charge of all the applications within the environment, in my opinion. This is something where if you have legacy applications that either need to stay legacy because of some line of business application is a common use case, or otherwise they have to take that on as an assumed risk or update according to their schedule without you needing to be involved in your base contract. So just some tips there, but this is the first one we're going to. All of the rest of these are going to be formatted the same way. So as we shift into patching operating systems, this is going to be, again, the same combination we took a look at before with Intune, leveraging the update rings for deployment, as well as Defender for Business and Endpoint, that it's going to monitor for, the Windows 11 vulnerabilities. And this is something where, again, user resistance should be pretty low here. We have some users that might not, have their device offline for a while and don't get patches. They want to avoid them. We have the classic, my computer's updating in the middle of the day and I'm frustrated from that. But most people are used to patching of their operating system at this point. Upfront cost here is medium. You have to have your devices managed. You have to deploy the update rings and get them to a good cycle that, depends on the hours of the business. And then your ongoing maintenance should be medium too, to make sure their patching, is being deployed and it's up to date. It is automatic with these controls, but you do have considerations for when zero-day events occur and things like that as well too, which is some of the challenges here. Obviously the grace periods, meaning how many times do you let a user defer the update window before you force that upon them? Usually 3 is a good number to give them plenty of chances to try to restart their device before restarting it when they're in the middle of creating a document, right? That's usually the best use case where that might blow away their work, as an example. 0 days, obviously, we need to be able to accommodate for an SOP that leverages some expedited workflows to get that done. We want to build variants into the deployment rings so that we can go ahead and make sure that we're piloting correctly, making sure we have some champion users that are getting the initial updates before deploying broadly. And then prerequisites, again, for this one is devices are enrolled into Intune and Defender. And this, from a licensing perspective, is something, again, Business Standard doesn't really fulfill today at all. Business Premium comes with Intune, which will give you the update rings. They've most recently included auto patch and hot patching into Business Premium, which is a really nice feature. And then vulnerability scanning is something that you do get as well with Defender for Business, but does come with E5 and the E5 add-on. Within the Microsoft portal, again, in Security Center, this is also where you would see your vulnerabilities associated to Windows 10, Windows 11 devices. You would see the devices that are exposed here. And in Intune, you're able to go into the Windows section, as an example, and see all the OS versions here, and then be able to manage your update rings that are going to be going out and dictate the deferral windows and things like that. So if I go into my baseline here, this is something where I've set the product update to have a deferral window for quality updates of 7 days and feature updates of 14 days. Not saying that's best practice. I would like to accommodate for the organization, but generally that's how we do this, just for any bugs to get worked out. So you don't have to think about rollbacks with any of these, but this is a way that you can deploy this and, have full control over the patching that's going out to the devices here from a Windows perspective. And Apple or Mac devices are also supported here as far as your update policies go. You can do this in the Mac OS section and then Mac OS updates. Less control than you get with Windows, but I've done a whole blog and video on this as well. Within CloudCapsule, we're taking a look at the same thing, very familiar to patching applications. And from the maturity levels here, again, it's very much in line with the same criticality and the amount of time that's passed since first notice that you've remediated this as well. So if you fail any of these, it's because you haven't patched them within that window, as an example. And then you may find that there are devices that are out of date, right, between the latest two versions of the operating system. So that might also cause you to fall outside of compliance. A lot of these are automated just to look for that for the OS layer. So some tips for getting started on this one. You want to get, again, all devices activated for Defender and Intune just to make sure you can set that up. You want to set up a ring deployment, make sure it's not causing any friction before deploying it broadly to other users. And then having an SOP, obviously, for 0 days, hot patching, auto patch capabilities is something that you can use to help reduce your overhead and administrative burden, but also get ahead of any exploits that you immediately spawn to rapidly within an organization that doesn't create a bunch of friction for the organization at the same time. Next, as we shift into multi-factor authentication here, obviously this is going to leverage intra and conditional access policies within Microsoft for enforcement. When we talk about this, the user resistance is usually high for MFA as a whole. That's why it's been harder to get this rolled out. But when we talk about the context of Essential 8, maturity groups 2 and 3 want you to start leveraging phishing-resistant methods, which I think is really hard for most of us today, given it's been hard to get people on basic forms of MFA, even SMS and phone, which are now considered weaker in nature. Upfront cost here is medium just because of the support burden in many cases, and then the ongoing maintenance is medium just because of the general adoption you have to have through movement or change of employees onboarding to the organization, people losing their phones with their MFA codes, things like that. That causes some challenges, but user adoption, I would say, is one of the heaviest challenges here, especially with phishing-resistant methods that we would see, such as a FIDO2 key or something like a passkey as an example. No real prerequisites with this one. Something you can enforce with basic licensing like standard, but if you want to manage the flexibility around that, conditional access is really going to be your go-to. And then phishing-resistant MFA is, again, something that they want to push, as well as having adequate sign-in logs to understand who's using MFA, what does it look like for the adoption across the organization, and strong forms, things like that. So within the Intra Admin Center, you can go under Protection, Conditional Access, and then Policies here. And this is where you'd go in and set up your MFA policy for users. And this today, is fulfilling a certain level of maturity group, but you want to make sure it's included to all users, excluding a break glass user, scoping to all applications, and then granting MFA, but granting access, I should say, but requiring the multi-factor authentication as well. So that's something that you can set up within the portal. Within CloudCapsule, we're looking at it being enforced for all users. We're looking for all forms of multi-factor to fulfill maturity group 1, meaning that they have any form registered, such as SMS, phone, email, and so on and so forth. But as you step up in the maturity group here, you also want to disable some of those legacy factors, have phishing resistant enabled multi-factor starting to roll out to the organization, at least the admins, and then continue to step up from there as far as your systems that you're protecting as well too. So some of the steps for getting started here, a lot of us still are on this legacy per user MFA enforcement, which is where you would assign user by user if it's enabled or enforced or disabled. Now you want to shift into conditional access policies, which give you more granular control, but also allows you to enforce more strict methods of MFA to users. You want to begin to start using phishing-resistant MFA for highly privileged roles like global admins or other admins in the account. And then a great way, I think, to start getting users to adopt phishing-resistant is to get them enrolled into Windows Hello for Business, which is a great way where they just use their native Face ID, as an example, on a Windows device to be able to sign in. It's usually the least amount of friction, I would say, from a phishing-resistant method. For that, but also requires hardware requirements as well as, there's basic end user training. They get really hung up, in my experience, from the Windows Hello PIN, comparatively speaking, to their password. They get very confused on that piece of it. And in some cases, there's that breakdown of, well, it's phishing resistant, but they could still have a PIN that gets compromised. So there's a lot of things to work through there, but effectively maturity group 1 here is just saying, hey, we're enforcing MFA. We want that to be applied to users. And then when we get to 2 and 3, let's knock off some of these weaker forms like SMS and voice. let's move into phishing resistant forms. And today, that's got to be limited to these 4 that you see here as an example. And passkeys being the most hyped, it's the thing that we can use in the future, but still far away from garnering mass adoption, in my opinion, just based off the end user friction that it causes. So as we dive into the restrict admin privileges section here, obviously your end user resistance should be low because this should be scoped to very limited users in the organization. Not everybody should have admin rights, very limited users should. Your upfront costs are going to be medium to low because there's not a ton of tasks that you need to do here, but they're very important tasks, obviously, of making sure that we have the things locked down to a least permissive model. We're storing and sharing credentials to these accounts very securely, and we're limiting our footprint there because of the exposure that would cause if those types of accounts were breached. And the ongoing maintenance should also be low, given after you institute things here, it should just be periodic review for who has admin rights on a periodic basis, should they still have those rights, as well as just the credentials and storage of those being managed very secure fashion. So when we talk about the Microsoft solutions here, primarily going to revolve around Intra, because this is focusing in on the identity layer. But every tenant that you have, no matter the licensing, is going to include some form of role-based access control. And this allows you to assign admin roles to users, view who those users are. But as you step up into other plans here, as far as the enterprise plans, you get access to a lot more governance features, as well as advanced features like privileged identity management that allow you to activate privilege roles for just in time, just enough access considerations and concepts versus having perpetual elevated admin users always. And then that goes into some identity governance and access review layers, which allows you to manage the life cycle and automate some of the periodic review process where you'd want to be checking those levels of access, as well as just reviewing those accounts in general. On the Intune side, you also have some protections there for local admins on devices. Things like credential guard, LSA protection is policies you can push out via configuration profiles that would allow you to help protect this here. And some of the challenges that I see when we take a look at this is obviously there's a lot of complexity around service accounts that you need to facilitate third-party integrations or internal automation, as an example. But in many cases, what I see is that users are leveraging users that access email every day and have a job versus separating those accounts out into 2 distinct users, and a separation of duties being in consideration. We have also considerations for break glass users where these are used specifically for emergency access, but the management of them, because they're excluded from policies, should be very much scrutinized because of the ways that they could be compromised in general. And so there's a lot of checks that you would want to make here in the management of those users. Done a whole blog post on this too, that I'll link below, but this is another important factor that you need to take into consideration. Prerequisites here on the device side is that devices are enrolled into Intune for being able to push out configuration profiles, but not necessarily anything else on the Intra side. So within Intra, you have capabilities here again for role-based access and being able to dictate who has roles within the organization. As you begin to scale out into additional licensing, you have considerations for the identity governance section, which includes things like privileged identity management, where you can go in and dictate who has access to roles within the environment and who's actually active versus eligible. That can be elevated just in time for the times that they need those roles, and then move back down after a period of time has expired. So it's a much more secure way to reduce your attack surface. I'm not going to get into all the controls as part of this review, but there is a lot of governance capabilities that you get as part of Entra P2 licensing. In CloudCapsule, as you step up through the maturity levels, you want to have requirements, obviously, for how people are asking and getting approval to certain roles. You want to have some considerations of the separation of duties I mentioned as well too, where you're not using them for day-to-day logins, for checking email and so on and so forth. And then as you step up in the maturity groups here, I'm not going to go through all these again for this as well, but it gets into the holistic governance layer of the lifecycle of those accounts and making sure that they have separation of environments in some cases. They have capabilities of the separation for break glass users, And then you have governance over monitoring of those users and being able to report them over time, as well as beginning to restrict that down even further as you continue up the maturity groups, so they're very isolated in their experience. So again, some of the top tips for getting started here is obviously you want to make sure you understand the global admins within your account. Those are your kings of the kingdom, if you will. And I see a lot of individuals that have a bunch of service accounts that they forgot that existed, that they're no longer in use, but still just sit there as another part of the attack surface. You want to set up those break glass or emergency access users for being able to get into the account if something is misconfigured with conditional access, but also make sure you are managing them appropriately. And then you want to obviously separate those admin duties. Again, just reiterating that because I see it all the time, but making sure you are separating out users specifically for that separation of duties. Next here, as we get into application control, this one causes me a little bit of pain when I think about it. And if you've ever done an application control rollout with something like App Locker or WDAC in the past, you know the same pain that we mostly feel for this. But the upfront cost, user resistance here is going to be high, mostly because we are locking things down for users not to be able to install applications, in a lot of cases update applications unless we've whitelisted them. And this causes a ton of friction in the organization, a lot of end user frustration if it's not appropriately audited and controlled. And you have to have proper SOPs in place for when new applications need to get onto the network or when there needs to be updates to existing applications on user workstations. And given the number of applications that exist normally on an end user device, this makes this very complex to go on and implement. Once you get past the initial phase of understanding how you're applying the solution in your whitelisting, the ongoing maintenance is medium to high, depending on the organization. But within here, we have some Microsoft solutions, mostly revolve around Intune. They've recently, come out with App Control for Business, which is like a new form of the application control or app locker that we previously have used in the past. But this does allow you to push out a policy centrally, and you can leverage these App Control Wizard to basically create your policy that you would be pushing out to end users, including the whitelisting, exclusions, and being able to turn that into audit mode so you can collect telemetry and understand the user impact before enforcing this completely. And then within the Intune Suite add-on, you have considerations for endpoint privilege management, which is an add-on to, again, existing licensing, but it acts as a application whitelisting or just-in-time elevation control tool for users to upgrade or update applications that have non-local admin rights on the computer, right? This is a common area of friction if we've made them local users on those computers. So challenges here I've mentioned already a little bit, but the end user friction being the highest one, and then just dealing with the periodic application updates that need to occur. So prerequisites here, you have to have devices enrolled into Intune. And from a licensing perspective, you have to have at least Intune to be able to deploy those applications and deploy something like App Control for Business. And then you would get access, into endpoint privilege management within the Intune Suite add-on. In Intune, you can go under the endpoint security section, and you'll see this App Control for Business. There's a whole support article on how to get this deployed out. You have to go through a manage installer and then control out this baseline policy, which you can use a wizard, to create the configuration settings that it's going to be in this XML format. But this is a friendly way with the user interface to generate this clunky, non-user-friendly XML file that you're going to upload within here. But this would allow you to designate the whitelisting that goes on, and this would be something that you might have to periodically update over time. As far as tips for getting started here, mentioned at the end, but audit mode first. Use the App Control Wizard to start to carve this up. And then you want to basically garner a list of approved application inventory that could be approved for both updates as well as installs. And then you want to have some type of SOP to understand when to make exclusions and going and doing that, because this is going to be where you create the most end user friction, is how long do they have to wait before they can get an application they need to do their job to either update or get installed on their device. On the Office macros side here, user resistance is usually medium, but depends on the organization and how often they're using macros. Upfront cost is medium here, just through the configuration setting, and ongoing maintenance I'd say is medium as well, just depending on any exclusions that you need to set up here in addition for approved macros potentially in the organization. We're going to be leveraging Microsoft Intune to push out configuration profiles to lock down those macro settings, and I'll link it in my documentation, but Microsoft has published a whole GitHub repository of predefined JSON objects here that you can leverage that would create these configuration profiles for you within Intune. And then you have some considerations here for your attack surface reduction rules that are part of your Defender for Business or Defender for Endpoint suite that you'd be able to push out here that would limit and restrict Office macros running and the actions that they can perform. One of the biggest challenges here today is that for Microsoft 365 apps for business, so if you're on the suite offering over here, this can be deployed to end user workstations, but end users can override and click through the settings, which I'll show you here in a minute, which is not necessarily a hard enforcement. It's a known issue, something that Microsoft doesn't solve for today, but a lot of reason why people align this into, the Essential 8 maybe not being suited necessarily for business users. We'll get into that a little bit more later. But also the end user impact here, just need to be cognizant of any finance individuals as an example that run macros a lot to do their job and disrupting them, which probably is a very significant cost to their organization if you do. Business Premium gets you access into some of the configuration profiles, obviously, and the ASR rules that you'll want to push out. But the hard enforcement here is only going to be performed through the apps for enterprise, again, on the enterprise plan. And the Intune Admin Center here, I've uploaded some of those policies from the GitHub repository that are recommended here for the Office hardening settings as well as the macro settings. And this has those macro settings defined here where you're configuring that and deploying that to the end user workstations and subsequent applications here for Office. Additionally, within this portal, if you go under endpoint security is where you'll see your attack surface reduction rules, and you'll be able to see the main policy here along with all of the settings you configured. And one of these here, when we talk about this entire list, we talk about Office communication from creating child processes, as an example, and this might be something like if after a macro runs, this is another event that could help block this as well. In CloudCapsule, we're doing a lot of automated checks for this one just because it's looking for those configuration profiles and specific settings within there to provide enforcement, as well as some of the ASR rules that you'd want to have, like Office macros blocking Win32 API calls. This is where I was mentioning, this is kind of a screenshot of a user that has applications for business that has those policies being pushed out where they can actually just override and enable the content here, which in this case is activating the macros that are to run behind the scenes. And this is running a simulation of a type of malicious attack. So this doesn't actually give you the level of protection on the business users or apps for business that I would want to see. So just note that if you want to turn these things into audit mode first for the ASR rules, just understand how this is going to impact the users within your organization. Same thing is true on understanding where the business macros exist today, and understanding if you need to whitelist anything there or be cognizant of that for particular users. And then understanding, obviously, the holistic impact based off of that for the organization. Application hardening is very similar here for what we're doing with ASR rules to begin with. The upfront cost, the user resistance, and ongoing maintenance can be medium. Obviously, depends on the organization as well here too. But what we want to do here is configure some of the hardening settings that start to restrict things down. I haven't seen anything here that's wildly restrictive in the sense of the policy pushing, things like that. ASR rules will always get into some level of friction for an organization depending on the applications that are running. But when we talk about 365 solutions, you have managed web browser capabilities with Edge, and then you have Office hardening considerations that we were just looking at, obviously within Intune at the configuration profile. And then on the licensing section here, we have some considerations where The attack surface reduction rules, again, aren't only available in starting in the business premium plans. And then you have some considerations here for those Office Hardening Managed Web Browser being compatible in both the business and the enterprise plans. So as far as some tips on getting started, I've created a whole video on attack surface reduction rules and going into audit mode and being able to add exclusions to those lists on approved applications that could be interacting with various attack surface reduction rule policies. And then understanding what this is going to do to end users once you turn it on, because you need to have a defined process for when, new applications are installed, and that kind of bundles through the patching of applications because you should be centrally deploying them, but more so the application whitelisting considerations here as well too. For the last mitigation strategy here for regular backups, this is largely going to be outside of Microsoft controls, but we'll run through it here. You have low user resistance here, should be low because this should be something happening behind the scenes. Upfront cost for configurations, medium, and then ongoing maintenance should be pretty low here. You're just monitoring these and you may have to run through a DR incident. You should be actually through a process of doing active DR incidents and recovery incidents as well too. And that's where you would have some complexity and maybe even some e-discovery if you're using the backups for that as well too. But in most cases, you're not going to be leveraging first-party Microsoft solutions, even though they do have a Microsoft 365 backup add-on that you can get for emails and files across Exchange, SharePoint, and OneDrive. Teams included, obviously, in that. But you do also have considerations for things like retention policies that can give you some form of redundancy, if you will. It's not the same thing as a backup, but this does give you some form of redundancy in the event of accidental deletion or deletion, as an example. But also defines, the life cycle of your data, which is a large part about what are we looking at with backups in general, right? We want data protection considerations and preservation for the life cycle. So some of the challenges here, again, some of the DR exercises you might want to do to recover emails, to do e-discovery, things like that. And ransomware scenarios, you obviously that's the larger complexity versus just saying like we've backed up your mailbox, right? As an example. But when we talk about this, retention policies you can get across the board as far as your base level licensing goes, and you can get more advanced with your configurations as you step up in licensing plans. But for email and file backup, again, this is going to be just a straight add-on, which is pretty cost inhibitive, I would say, for business users because it's a per gigabyte cost that you are charged versus some other traditional third-party tools. And I like the redundancy going outside of Microsoft's cloud for this as well. So a large part of these controls are going to be looked at from a third-party lens, but some of the policies you want to look at here are related to the retention policies. Tips for getting started here is obviously looking for a great third-party solution for this. In our space, in the MSP space, you got some big players like Dropsuite, Cronus, Skykick, even as an example. And then you've got considerations for performing those tabletop exercises for DR, right? Are we still good to go on restoring some client's email if they go through a ransomware incident or their files, as an example of this too. So to begin to wrap up here, I just want to quickly recap all of what I went through today. Obviously, was very fast paced, and you might be thinking, Nick, you just briefly went over some of the admin portals, but as we conclude here, I also just wanted to lightly provide my insights or my opinion on the pros and cons of the Essential 8 framework at a high level, not even just as it relates to Microsoft. I think, number one, it's obviously nice to have a framework that's backed by the government, that's taking it through proper life cycle for review, for iteration, for heavy considerations before pushing it out. It's obviously much better than you trying to manage your own internal security checklist that isn't really looking at macro considerations across the entire ecosystem. I think that if you implement the Essential 8, you'll significantly reduce your attack surface. There's no question about that, especially obviously you get to maturity group 3, you're going to be way better protected for what you can do. And I also like, because they have the maturity buckets, you give yourself a sense of perception of where you are today, but where can we continually improve and evaluate those costs, right? Back to the business, the upfront cost, the ongoing maintenance, the cost to the end users as far as their friction goes. So it's really great in the sense of being able to step up. On the cons here, though, I think that this largely is not built for the average SMB. I called out some of the licensing limitations that really give you much better protection if you were to step up into E5 licensing. But that might also be part of your maturity group path as an organization. You say, hey, we're here now. We want to get to maturity group 2. We need E5 licensing to do that, as an example of this as well too. But I think for the average business user, it's a lot of friction that they're going to be introducing to the organization if you were to implement these security standards. Things like application control, as well as limiting office macros, pushing out ASR rules. Those are all great to do, and I'd highly recommend doing them. But it's a lot of end user friction, and a lot of planning is going to be needed, which increases your overall upfront cost. And then third con I would say today is there's just seemingly some gaps, in my opinion, comparatively speaking, if we compare this to a framework like the CIS controls that have 18 different categories there that you're looking at for things that you want to do over time versus these 8 that, at a certain level gets very specific, like our office macros being a top level mitigation strategy, which seems like it should be in a subcategory somewhere. As an example of this, not a holistic control we try to aim for, not downplaying the significance of it, but just saying that seems like it's weird that it's in a top level position. And then I put in the example here, like we didn't really cover anything related to email security, which is one of the highest attack vectors today for users being exposed to compromise. Adversary in the middle attacks, phishing attempts, things like that. Is not really covered by this framework. So I think there's some gaps there that you really need to factor in, to a holistic cybersecurity strategy. That's just my 2 cents, but wanted to provide that as the last piece of feedback and context before we wrapped up today.
Okay guys, that's everything I had for you today. Definitely comment below with any questions you had. Be sure to check out the link in the description of this video to get your free copy of the self-assessment, and check out CloudCapsule to run a free assessment against your tenant to see where you stand against the Essential 8 today. Thanks guys, I'll see you next week.